Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Bird, and I'm representing the Last Chance Gas Capstone team. Our advisor is Jessica Prada. So our capstone project originates with Governor Andrew Cuomo signing on to the Multi-State Zero-Emission Vehicle Action Plan last May. As part of this plan, New York has agreed to contribute 800,000 zero-emission vehicles to the roads by 2025. The organization responsible for achieving this goal is the New York State Department of Transportation, who are our clients for this capstone. So the DOT has two key goals to achieve in order to put more sustainable vehicles on the road by 2025. The first being to identify the best fuel options for New York. Now, the Zero Emission Vehicle Action Plan actually only looks at zero-emission vehicles, which are vehicles that do not have tailpipe emissions, such as electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. The DOT, however, was interested in expanding the scope of our study to include all alternative fuel vehicle sources, such as biodiesel, ethanol, liquefied natural gas, among others, as the DOT feels that all these fuel sources are potentially important for the long-term sustainability of New York's transportation system. Therefore, one of the first questions the DOT had for us was simply, what kind of alternative fuel vehicles, AFVs, are out there? To understand which fuel types might be best for New York, they also wanted us to look at how polluting each type was, but also what infrastructure, both policy and physical, was currently in place to support them. Once the best fuel options for New York have been identified, the DOT's second key goal is to encourage the adoption of those options. So the DOT also asked us to help them better understand what are the costs to the consumer for owning an alternative fuel vehicle, and why aren't consumers purchasing them now? The DOT also wanted us to look at what other states were doing to see if there were some lessons that New York might be able to learn. So the answers to all of these questions will be presented to the DOT in the form of two key deliverables. The first being a brief for policymakers, and the second being content guidelines for consumer-facing documents that the DOT could then assemble and put on their website or distribute at car dealerships, rest areas, and other public areas to raise awareness about alternative fuel vehicles. So before we could identify the best options for New York, we first had to narrow our scope down to the most feasible options. Ultimately, we chose to look at the 4 alternative fuel vehicle sources that you see at the bottom of the slide here in more detail. We also included conventional gasoline cars in our analyses to serve as a baseline. Now, these are just the fuel types that could feasibly achieve widespread adoption by 2025. To determine which of these might actually be best for New York, we had to further look at their greenhouse gas emissions, cost of ownership, barriers to adoption, fueling infrastructure, and finally, current supporting policies. To start with, we conducted a life cycle greenhouse gas emission analysis. We broke our analysis down into 2 parts. The first part being emissions associated with the production and use of the fuel, which are the blue bars that you see here. The second part was emissions associated with the manufacture and disposal of the vehicle itself, which are the orange bars. As you can see, in general, alternative fuel vehicles produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional vehicles, with the exception of E85 vehicles. Though there is some debate as to whether or not emissions associated with E85 should be lowered in order to account for carbon absorbed during the growing of the feedstock. Another thing to note is that most of the emissions tend to come from the production and use of the fuel, which is why electric vehicles, which do not have any tailpipe emissions, perform so well. Interestingly, electric vehicles charged in New York actually produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to national averages, as the chart on the right here shows. That's because New York tends to get its electricity from cleaner burning natural gas and hydropower rather than coal, which makes electric vehicles an even more attractive option for New York from an emissions standpoint. While emissions are certainly important, consumers tend to care more about costs. So we also conducted a cost of ownership analysis. To determine the total cost of owning an alternative fuel vehicle over its entire lifetime, we first looked at its initial cost, which includes its sticker price less any rebates or incentives. We then added in its annual costs, which include maintenance fees and fuel costs, and then finally we subtracted out its scrap value to yield the total cost. We then conducted a partial sensitivity analysis to determine how fluctuations in fuel prices might affect relative costs of ownership. What we discovered is that, in general, alternative fuel vehicles are cheaper than conventional vehicles, with electric vehicles being significantly cheaper. So the question becomes, if alternative fuel vehicles, and especially electric vehicles, produce fewer carbon emissions and are cheaper to own, why isn't everyone buying them? And the answer is that there's significant barriers to adoption, one of the most prominent of which is range anxiety. Range anxiety means that drivers are reluctant to own alternative fuel vehicles out of fear they might get stranded somewhere because there's no fueling station with their particular fuel type nearby, or if they're an electric vehicle owner because it takes too long to charge their battery. So this is a known problem that DOT asked us to look more into. They wanted to better understand how the fueling infrastructure for each type of fuel was distributed across the state in order to identify gaps in this infrastructure. So to visually show where the gaps are, we conducted a GIS gap analysis. To start, we mapped out all of the public fueling stations for each fuel type along New York's major highways. The colored circles that you see on this map here are the area within which someone would feel comfortable driving if they had that particular vehicle type, which in the example shown is an electric vehicle. The red lines outside these circles are where the gaps in the infrastructure are. And these are the highways and areas where a driver might start to experience range anxiety if they had an electric vehicle. So as you can see, in general, there's fairly decent coverage for electric vehicles across the state, but there's still some significant gaps between major New York cities. While many people never need to drive from New York City to Rochester, for example, a consumer may choose not to purchase an electric vehicle simply because someday they might need to drive from New York to Rochester. It wouldn't be able to do it if they owned an electric vehicle. Therefore, addressing these infrastructure gaps is critically important to encouraging consumer adoption of these vehicles. So our analysis showed that range anxiety is definitely a potential barrier to adoption, but it's not the only challenge alternative fuel vehicles face. The next key challenge is the higher upfront cost. So we mentioned previously that the total cost of ownership for alternative fuel vehicles is lower than conventional cars. But these savings generally result from lower annual fuel costs and are realized slowly over time. Therefore, even though alternative fuel vehicles tend to be cheaper in the long run, a lot of consumers simply cannot afford the higher upfront cost, which is definitely a disincentive to purchase these vehicles. The final major concern that we also identified was just a general lack of awareness about these vehicles. Many people simply don't know the alternatives available to them, nor do they understand the benefits and limitations of each type. So to address all of these barriers, we turned to policy for a solution. First, we took stock of all the policies and incentives available both within New York State and federally. And we discovered there's actually quite a few incentives related to alternative fuel vehicles. However, most of them tend to relate to hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles. Perhaps more importantly, most of them were aimed at reducing the total cost of ownership rather than promoting the fueling infrastructure or raising awareness about the vehicles. Therefore, we turned to other states to see what they were doing, to see if there were some lessons New York could learn. And it turns out there's quite a few, especially in regards to infrastructure and awareness raising. For example, Washington, Oregon, and California have joined together to form the West Coast Electric Highway, which is the network of fast chargers for electric vehicles pictured in the map on the left. The states have not limited their focus to just hybrid and electric vehicles either. For example, Washington has a number of policies promoting the production and sale of biofuels. From an awareness standpoint, California has really been a leader, targeting not only the consumers directly, but also car dealerships and other influencers of consumer opinion. So to summarize, first we identified the options that would be feasible for New York. We then analyzed the emissions, cost of ownership, and fueling infrastructure. Finally, we conducted a policy analysis to see the other policies and programs other states have enacted to address the key barriers of adoption. And this brings us to where we are today. Moving forward, the DOT will be able to take our findings and use them to achieve their two key goals, which again are to identify the best fueling options for New York and to encourage the adoption of those options. Based on our analyses, we do have a few suggestions to help them along their way. The first being to analyze the non-greenhouse gas emissions. So we presented the DOT with a life cycle analysis of all the carbon emissions for each fuel type we looked at. However, we didn't look at non-GHG emissions such as SOx and NOx as deeply. Therefore, further study is needed to determine if widespread adoption of alternative fueled vehicles might inadvertently increase concentrations of these non-GHG air pollutants to potentially harmful levels. Next, we suggest that the DOT take our gap analysis, which identifies general gaps in the infrastructure, and pinpoint specific locations for fueling stations to fill those infrastructure gaps. We also suggest they look especially at the electric vehicle infrastructure to ensure that there's enough fast chargers distributed across the state. So using the information about emissions, cost of ownership, fueling infrastructure, and barriers to adoption, the DOT will be positioned to select the fuel types that make the most sense for New York and start solidifying their strategy for driving adoption of those types. As part of that strategy, they will be able to use the content guidelines that we are providing them to draft these consumer-facing documents that they can distribute in order to raise awareness about alternative fuel vehicles, but also to market the specific fuel types identified as the most beneficial for New York. Finally, we hope that the DOT will also work with policymakers to determine if the innovative policies and programs we identified that other states have been using would also be suitable for New York. So again, I'm Julia Bird, representing the Last Chance Gas Capstone Workshop.